A rough bloke named Barry thought he could scare a royal guard with shouting and a hit, but after one sharp smack, he was down, spitting out teeth. Here's what happened. Before we go on, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you respect the royal guards. The summer sun was blazing down on the area outside Buckingham Palace. Barry Stone pushing through the holidaymakers, his big body made strong from street brawls, not proper training. Barry was 6'3" and cast a big shadow. "Get out of the way," he muttered, pushing past a mum who was too slow getting her kids out of the way. He smelled of cheap booze and old fags, very different from the clean palace grounds. He kept clenching his fists, covered in scars from pub fights, looking around like he was hunting. The crowd moved away from him, knowing the feeling of trouble before it starts. Barry's vest showed arms full of rough tattoos, each one a memory of nights proving he was the toughest in back-alley scraps. His eyes were red from a morning in London's worst pubs, and had the look of someone wanting a fight. "Bloody tourists!" He spat on the clean stones, his London accent strong. "Standing about like sheep, taking pictures of what?" He looked at the palace walls with a look he'd used many times before. Just a posh jail with posh guards. A group of kids hurried past, their teacher keeping them away from Barry. He watched them with a nasty laugh that echoed across the area. "That's right, run. Teach them early what real power is." His heavy shoes scraped on the ground as he walked around, each step on purpose, like he was claiming the area. The sun caught the metal knuckle duster in his back pocket, not for show, but a tool he'd used enough to feel like part of him. "Watch it," he growled at an old man who didn't move fast enough. The old man's military look and calm only made Barry angrier. Something about order, respect, and control annoyed him, like an itch he could only scratch with fighting. Then Barry saw the Royal Guard standing still. The Guard's perfect stance and clean uniform showed everything Barry hated: control, authority, respect that was earned. The sun caught the Guard's shiny buttons and medals, making Barry's scowl even worse. "Well, well," he said loudly, walking around the Guard like a predator, each step meant to scare. "Another toy soldier standing pretty for the photos." The Guard stayed still, but there was a tension in him, only seen by those who knew what to look for, that showed years of real fighting experience. His eyes, looking straight ahead, had seen things Barry couldn't even imagine. "Oi, mate!" Barry moved closer, getting into the Guard's space. The smell of old beer got stronger as he leaned in, his face close to the Guard's. "What's wrong? Too posh to talk." He stood right in front of the Guard, blocking tourists' photos. Two old soldiers watching nearby stood up straighter, their own military past showing. One touched his medals, seeing something in the Guard's quiet power, not in Barry's attempt to look strong. "You think you're special," Barry went on, his voice getting louder. "Standing there in your fancy clothes, playing soldier while real men do real fighting." He pointed to his own scarred knuckles, proud marks of street violence that looked silly next to the Guard's real medals. The crowd started to move, feeling the trouble coming. Parents pulled their kids away, while other tourists made space around what was happening. A palace security guard in the distance saw and spoke into his radio, but Barry was too focused on the Guard. "What's the matter, soldier boy?" He waved his hand near the Guard's face, his knuckles almost touching the bearskin hat. "Can't speak? Can't move? Or just scared?" His laugh was harsh against the palace's dignified background. "Yeah, that's it. Hide behind that uniform 'cause you've got nothing else." The Guard didn't move, but there was a change, clear to those who knew real strength. The kind made in battle, not pub fights, the kind that doesn't need to be shown with silly challenges. "You know what I think." Barry spat on the ground near the Guard's shiny boots, his face angry at being ignored. "I think you're just a pretend soldier, but you've never been in a real fight, not like me." He flexed his fingers, remembering many street brawls. Maybe it's time someone showed you what a real man can do. The old soldiers looked at each other, knowing what was coming. They didn't move to stop it. Something in the guard's look told them he didn't need help, but they stayed close, watching. Barry's face was red, his pride hurt by the guard's silence. He bounced on his feet, a boxer's stance that showed more back-alley brawls than training. "Listen up!" he shouted to the crowd, his voice showing the desperation of a man losing patience. "Your fancy guard here is about to learn what happens when you ignore the wrong bloke." His fingers curled into fists, knuckles white with anger. The guard stayed still, but there was something deadly in his stillness, like a coiled spring under control. His parade stance hid years of combat training. The sun caught his medals, showing battles in far-off places, where the stakes were higher than a thug's hurt pride. "Last chance, soldier boy." Barry circled closer, his movements more threatening. "Show me something. A blink, a twitch, anything." Sweat was on his forehead, from the heat or frustration. "Or are you just going to stand there and take what's coming?" The older soldier shifted, knowing that stance from places where fighting wasn't a game and the results were serious. The guard's stillness wasn't just for show anymore. It was the careful waiting of a hunter, letting its prey move into place. "You think that uniform protects you?" Barry's voice was a dangerous whisper. "Think those medals make you special?" His right hand clenched and unclenched, a sign any trained fighter would know. "Let's see how special you feel with a few teeth missing." The crowd was bigger now, drawn by the tension. Some had phones out, but most stood quietly, watching the start of violence they knew was coming. A boy asked his dad why the bad man was being mean. The dad didn't answer, his face worried. Barry rolled his shoulders like a wave of violence. "Time's up, soldier." His feet moved wider, showing his plans to everyone. "Let's see what they teach you in guard school about, His words stopped as he pulled back his fist. A beginner's mistake. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't even blinked, but his stillness had changed, less showy, more tactical. Anyone with real fighting experience would have seen the shift in his weight, the tension in his shoulders showing trained reflexes ready. Barry's fist flew, clumsy like a pub fighter, fueled by anger more than skill. The punch hit the guard's jaw, freezing time. The sound echoed across the silent area. The guard's head snapped sideways, more from taking the blow than damage. His bearskin hat didn't move. A drop of blood appeared at the corner of his mouth, red against his calm face. "Ha!" Barry shouted, shaking his hand, showing pain from hitting something harder than he expected. "Not so special now, are you?" His voice was trying to sound like he'd won. The guard's head slowly went back, so controlled it seemed robotic. The blood went down his chin, marking his white collar with a red dot. His eyes, which had been looking ahead, now locked onto Barry's face. The change was big. The statue was gone, replaced by something that made the watching soldiers step back. They knew that look, from places where fighting wasn't a game. "That all you got?" Barry taunted, but his voice was less sure. Something about the guard's reaction, or lack of it, had confused him. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People were supposed to fall when he hit them, show fear or at least pain. The guard's calm was like a mirror, showing Barry's weaknesses. The crowd was silent. Parents covered their children's eyes, tourists lowered their phones, and even the birds seemed quiet. The sun made long shadows, turning the scene into a picture of opposites, one fueled by cheap beer and anger, the other made in real combat. Blood kept going down the guard's chin, but his expression hadn't changed. If anything, his stance seemed even better, more precise, as if the punch had reminded him of standards learned where violence had real meaning. The red drop fell on his brass button, shining like a jewel. Barry's moment of winning was fading, turning to confusion, then anger, as he realized his best shot had only decorated the guard's uniform. His fists clenched, ready to throw another punch to prove he was still in charge. That's when the guard spoke, his voice having the calm authority of someone who had faced worse than pub bullies. The words changed everything. "You punch like a girl." The guard's voice cut through the tension, each word careful and calm, like stating something obvious. His eyes hadn't moved from Barry's face, but now they had a power that made Barry step back. The guard's stance shifted, not breaking rules, but changing for what was coming. "I could have stopped that punch before it started." His voice was heavy with experience, not boasting, just truth. "Saw it coming from when you started showing off. Poor form, obvious angle, all power and no skill." Barry's face flushed, but something kept him still. Maybe it was the guard's eyes that had seen real combat, real results, real death. "You're lying," he said, but his voice was less confident. "You just stood there and took it like a trained soldier." The guard's voice stayed calm, but there was steel underneath. "Let me explain something about real combat, mate. While you were having your pub fights, I was in Helmand, watching rockets hit armored vehicles. While you were fighting drunks, I was carrying injured friends through sniper fire." The veterans nearby nodded, knowing that tone. Someone who had seen the world's worst and come back carrying weights that thugs like Barry couldn't understand. "That punch," the guard went on, the blood on his collar now dry and dark. "I've taken worse from kids in war zones. Your street fighting means nothing to someone who's had to hold a friend's veins closed waiting for a helicopter. Your attempts to scare—" A hint of a smile touched his lips, cracking the dried blood. "I've faced suicide bombers with more guts than you'll ever have." Barry opened his mouth, but the guard wasn't done. "Rules say we stay at our post, show control, be the traditions we stand for. So I let your punch land, chose to take it, because compared to real danger, compared to bullets hitting sand near your head, compared to watching friends fall—" He paused, his eyes piercing Barry's soul. "Compared to real combat, you're just a kid having a tantrum." The crowd had moved closer, drawn by the quiet authority in the guard's voice. The sun seemed brighter, lighting the scene. Barry's swagger now looked empty against the guard's real confidence. "But—" The guard's voice dropped, carrying an edge that made people step back. "While rules guide us, they also allow for a proper response to an attack. And since you can't understand anything but violence—" His eyes flicked to Barry's bruised knuckles, then back to his face. "Maybe it's time I showed what a real soldier can do." The guard's next move was almost invisible, just a slight shift in stance, a tiny change of weight. But to the veterans watching, it spoke volumes. They'd seen that before, in moments before lightning, in the calm before a storm. "You wanted my attention." The guard's voice was certain. "Congratulations, you have it. Now let me show you the difference between your silly showing off and what happens when you annoy someone who's seen real war." Barry felt it then. Real fear. Maybe for the first time. But it was too late. The guard's next move would change his idea of power, strength, and the results of disrespect. The guard's punch was nothing like Barry's. It was perfect, a work of art in movement, delivered with military skill. The movement started not from the shoulder, but from the ground up. Power going through perfectly placed feet, through legs made strong by years of standing guard, through a core strengthened by combat gear and battlefield moves. Time seemed to slow as the guard's white-gloved fist went on its path. There was no wasted movement, no sign, no amateur mistakes, just pure, controlled violence from years of training, the kind of punch combat teachers use as examples that battlefield veterans know as the difference between fighting and just brawling. The hit was awful, The sound of knuckles hitting jaw echoed like a gunshot, followed by the crack of teeth breaking. Barry's head snapped back, bits of blood and teeth scattering, catching the sunlight like grim jewels before falling on the stones. He stumbled, his legs forgetting their street-fighting stance. Blood poured from his mouth, mixing with spit he couldn't hold back. 2 broken teeth skittered across the ground, stopping near tourists' feet. His hand went to his face, fingers feeling the new gaps in his smile as his eyes widened with shock and pain. The guard's voice had the same calm tone, his stance back to perfect. That's how a soldier punches. See the difference? He hadn't even taken a full step from his post. The whole counterattack had been done with barely any change from the rules. Barry tried to speak, but only a wet gurgle came out. Blood dribbled down his chin, staining his vest. His attempts at words turned into grunts, each one sending more red drops to join the stain on his chest. Trying to say something. The guard's question had no mockery, just the interest of someone checking how well something worked. I'm afraid that might be hard for a while. Your teeth need a lot of work. The veterans watching nodded. They knew the technique, not the showy violence of films or street brawls, but the effective brutality taught to those who might need to end fights quickly. 1 hit, precisely delivered, with just enough force to stop without killing. Barry swayed, his confidence gone, replaced by confused pain. Each attempt to speak made only mumbled sounds, made worse by the blood and spit he couldn't control. The man who had been so keen to show his toughness now stood dribbling like a child, his attempts at dignity ruined by his body's reactions. If you're wondering about the damage, the guard went on, his voice like a combat medic, that was a textbook hit targeting the jaw's nerve. We learn it not for show, but for combat. The same technique that's taken down bad guys in other places works just as well on overconfident people here. Blood kept dripping from Barry's mouth, making a puddle. His attempts to keep his tough guy image were now sad. Each mumbled try at speech sent more red down his chin, each try at standing straight, ruined by the shock in his system. I'd suggest getting medical help quickly, the guard advised, his stance perfect again. The human jaw has important nerves that, when hit right, can cause a lot of damage. You'll find the local hospital has a good dental surgery. Barry managed one last sound before his legs gave way. He fell to his knees, hands on his broken jaw, pride lying in pieces around him like his teeth. The man who had arrived full of swagger now knelt in his own blood, unable to even swear properly. 2 police officers arrived, their faces calm despite the scene. Blood still dripped from Barry's mouth as they helped him up, his attempts to resist only resulting in more sounds and red marks on his chest. Barry's attempts to argue came out as wet gurgles, each try at speech causing pain through his broken jaw, making more blood dribble. The tough street fighter was now making sounds like a toddler. The guard was back at his post, his stance perfect again. The only sign of the fight was a small blood stain on his white collar and the slightly red knuckle of his glove, both making him look even more intimidating. His eyes were looking ahead, as if the whole thing had been just a small interruption. "Get him to the hospital," one officer told his partner, looking at the trail of blood Barry was leaving. "They should be able to handle this kind of facial damage." He turned to the guard, nodding. "We'll need a statement later, but I think we all saw this was self-defense." Barry tried to speak, maybe to argue, but all that came out was a weak sound, followed by more blood. His eyes, wide with pain and shame, darted between the guard and the puddle of red. The man who had arrived full of energy now couldn't even manage a proper curse. The older veteran went to the officers, his medals catching the sun. "If you need witnesses," he offered. "There are several of us who saw everything. The guard showed amazing control." His companion nodded, both men having the look of those who knew the difference between needed force and too much. As the police led Barry away, his awkward stumbling different from his earlier swagger, the guard's voice carried across the area one last time. "Remember this moment," he said, his tone not showing victory or nastiness, just observation. "Every drop of blood you're spitting, every tooth you're leaving behind, they're teaching you something about real strength that your street fights never could." Barry's only answer was another wet gurgle, his earlier confidence drowned in blood. The tough guy act had been knocked out of him, replaced by the sad sight of a man who couldn't even curse his own humiliation properly. The crowd started to leave, parents guiding their children away while quietly explaining that violence, while sometimes needed, was never the first answer. The veterans stayed a bit longer, sharing knowing looks before leaving. They understood that what they had seen wasn't just a fight. It was a lesson about real strength versus fake bravado, delivered in the only way a bully could understand. Bloodstains dried slowly on the old stones of Buckingham Palace as the mourning crowd went back to normal. The guard stood at his post, exactly as he had been before Barry arrived, his bearing carrying the same dignity, but now with something else, a reminder that under the ceremonial look were warriors shaped in real combat. The red drops Barry had left began to darken against the pale stones, like full stops at the end of his lesson. His teeth, scattered during the guard's precise strike, were collected as evidence by the police, though no charges would be filed. After all, how could Barry press charges when he couldn't even speak clearly enough to give a statement? The guard's white glove, slightly stained at the knuckle, would be replaced during the next changing of the guard, the only sign of the morning's violence. The small bloodstain on his collar would be cleaned, his uniform made perfect again, as if washing away the last bits of a lesson that had to be taught. But there would be no happy ending here, no moment of understanding for Barry, no sudden understanding of respect or tradition. Some people, it seemed, could only learn through pain, and even then, the lesson might not stick. His broken jaw would heal eventually, new teeth would replace the old, but the shame of being reduced to childish gurgling would stay far longer than any physical wound. The guard remained at his post as the sun climbed higher, his shadow stretching across the stones where Barry's blood still dried. He stood as he always had, as others would after him, a living reminder that true strength wasn't in the ability to hurt, but in the control to hold back, and the wisdom to know when that control must be released. What would you have done in the guard's place? While violence shouldn't be the first choice, sometimes it's the only language some people understand. When faced with bullies who mistake holding back for weakness, is there a point where a physical answer becomes not just right, but needed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you seen times where someone learned the hard way that ceremony doesn't mean weakness? Tell us your story. And if this story of justice being served touched you, make sure to join our community of people who respect tradition and understand true strength. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of those who guard our values and what happens to those who test their limits.